Sarah intensified the rate at which she hawked oranges, walking through the streets, selling what she could to raise enough money for her mother's treatment. One day, as Sarah carried a tray of oranges on her head, she heard a sound behind her. She turned startled and collided with a young man walking in the opposite direction. He is wearing a doctor's coat. The tray of oranges tumbled to the ground, rolling across the street. "I'm so sorry," the young man exclaimed, quickly kneeling to help her pick up the scattered fruit. Sarah, flustered and embarrassed, knelt down as well. "It's fine, I wasn't looking where I was going." As they gathered the oranges, their eyes met. The young man was captivated by Sarah's beauty, her soft features and determined expression. Sarah, in turn, was taken aback by his kindness and striking appearance. The young man smiled as he placed the last orange in the tray and helped her lift it back onto her head. "There you go." "Thank you," Sarah smiled back, avoiding his gaze as she hurried away. The young man watched her leave, his mind racing. Something about her seemed familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. The young man Sarah had collided with was none other than Ken, now known as Dr. Alex. After years of hard work, he had become a successful doctor and had returned to his childhood town with the hope of giving back to his society. He had even built a new hospital to help those in need. Dr. Alex had come back for one reason in particular: to fulfill his mother's last wish to find the kind teacher who had believed in him when no one else did. However, after years of being away, he was unable to get enough information that would help him locate Mrs. Dan. Every weekend, when he was not working, he walked through the area, asking people if they knew of a teacher who had once taught a boy with a learning disability. He was met with blank stares. No one could give him a clear answer. Frustration began to grow within him. Meanwhile, Sarah's situation at home worsened. Mr. Gooder, the landlord, had returned, furious that Sarah continued to refuse his advances. "You think you're better than everyone else, don't you?" Mr. Gooder sneered. "But without my help, your mother will die, and you'll be out in the streets." Sarah stood her ground, tears of anger welling up in her eyes. "I would rather work and pray for a miracle than betray my values, Mr. Gooder." Mr. Gooder's face contorted with rage, but he stormed out once again, vowing to return. Back inside, Sarah knelt by her mother's side, noticing that Mrs. Dan was losing consciousness. Panic surged through her. Without wasting another moment, she decided to take her mother to the new hospital in town, hoping they could start treatment with the little money she had managed to save. At the hospital, Sarah made her mother sit on the reception chair while she frantically approached the reception desk, where Nurse Jane, a cold and calculating nurse, sat. Sarah pleaded with her, tears streaming down her face. "Please, my mother is very sick. We don't have much money, but I'll pay whatever I can. Just please help her." Nurse Jane eyed her with disdain. "If you don't have the required amount for her treatment, we can't help you." Sarah sobbed, feeling the weight of the world crashing down on her. Just as she heads to the main reception room where her mother was waiting, she bumped into someone again. It was Dr. Alex. Their eyes locked. Dr. Alex felt a sense of familiarity wash over him. "We've met before, right?" Sarah nods. "What are you doing here?" he asked further gently. "My mother is sick, she needs help, but they won't treat her because we don't have enough money," Sarah explained, her voice trembling. Dr. Alex's expression softened. He walked up to Nurse Jane. "Take her mother to the emergency room immediately." Nurse Jane hesitated, jealousy flickering in her eyes. She had been trying to win Dr. Alex's attention for months now to no avail. Now this girl was receiving his compassion. However, she had no choice but to obey. As Mrs. Dunn was wheeled into the emergency room, Sarah sat in the waiting area, overwhelmed with gratitude to God. She couldn't believe that this stranger had been so kind to her. Hours later, Dr. Alex emerged from the operating room. "The surgery went well," he said with a gentle smile on his face. "Your mother will need some time to recover, but she'll be okay." Sarah wept with relief. Thank you so much." Dr. Alex nodded, but something tugged at the back of his mind. There was something familiar about her. Later that day, as Dr. Alex was reviewing Mrs. Dunn's medical file, he came across her name. His heart skipped a beat. Mrs. Dunn. Could it be her? He called the nurse's station and instructed Nurse Jane to call Sarah. Nurse Jane, still seething with jealousy, went over to Mrs. Dunn's hospital room and called Sarah. Sarah, confused and nervous, entered Dr. Alex's office. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with realization. "Was your mother a teacher?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Did she once teach a boy named Ken who had a learning disability?" Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "Yes, she did. He was my friend too. How did you know about him?" Dr. Alex's heart swelled with joy. "Sarah, I'm Ken. I'm that boy." Sarah gasped. She rushed to hug him. "I can't believe it. You're Ken." They embraced, still in shock, unable to believe their reality. Sarah led Dr. Alex to her mother's hospital room. Mrs. Dunn, weak but conscious, looked up in shock when she saw him. "Ken, is that really you?" Mrs. Dunn whispered, her voice trembling. "It's me, Mrs. Dunn," Dr. Alex replied softly. "The little boy you saved and gave a new hope when all hope was lost." Mrs. Dunn's eyes welled up with tears. "I'm so proud of you. What about your mother and your father?" Dr. Alex's expression grew somber. "They died a few years ago." Mrs. Dunn sobs for a few minutes, mourning Mrs. Paul. Dr. Alex holds her hand. "Weep not, Mrs. Dunn, my mother died peacefully. After we reunited with my father, my parents grew so much in love that when my father died, my mother begged God to take her too. I guess he answered her cause she became sick shortly and died happily." Mrs. Dunn nods. "May their souls rest in peace, amen," Dr. Alex and Sarah echoed. Mrs. Dunn reached out and took Ken's hand. "You've grown into a fine, great man, Ken. I always knew you would." Ken smiles. "I'm sorry we couldn't reach out after we traveled. My mother lost your contact." "I understand, Ken." Mrs. Dunn nods. She leads them in a Thanksgiving prayer. From that day on, Dr. Alex took care of Mrs. Dunn and Sarah. He brought them food, fruit, and anything they needed. He ensured that Mrs. Dunn had the best care possible at the hospital. When it was time for Mrs. Dunn to be discharged, Dr. Alex insisted on driving them back to their home. But when they arrived, they were met with a humiliating scene. Mr. Gooder, the landlord, had locked them out. "You're out," he barked. "I've had enough of your excuses. If you don't want my help, you can find somewhere else to live." Before Sarah could respond, Dr. Alex stepped forward, his voice cold and firm. "Don't bother, Mr. Gooder. Your house is rather not fit for them. They actually deserve better."
Mr. Gooder's face paled when he recognized Dr. Alex, the prestigious and well-respected doctor in town. I didn't mean... They'll be staying with me from now on," Dr. Alex interrupted. "You've lost any chance of helping them." Mr. Gooder, humiliated and defeated, slunk away. Dr. Alex helped Sarah and her mother into his car, drove them first to a boutique to buy different clothes and accessories, then he took them to his home, a beautiful mansion on the edge of town. Life in Dr. Alex's home was peaceful and comfortable. He had a large kitchen, and the next morning, Sarah decided to cook for them. The smell of delicious food filled the house, and as Dr. Alex ate, he was amazed. "This is incredible," he said, his eyes lighting up. "You're an amazing cook, Sarah." Sarah blushed, smiling shyly. "Thank you." Dr. Alex offered to help Sarah go back to school. Sarah and her mother were elated. This had always been Mrs. Dan's greatest dream from childhood. Sarah had always wanted to be a teacher, just like her mother. She wanted to teach and give hope to hopeless children, just like her mother did. Dr. Alex taught Sarah how to drive, then allowed her go to school with his cars. As the years rolled by, Dr. Alex and Sarah grew closer. Each day Dr. Alex returned from work and Sarah returned from school. They often spent evenings talking, sharing stories of their encounters during the day, and laughing together. Dr. Alex found himself falling more and more in love with Sarah's personality, her kindness, her strength, and her unwavering integrity. But he was careful not to show it. He didn't want her to think that his kindness toward her family was tied to his feelings. He didn't want her to feel like she owed him anything. He also didn't know how Mrs. Dan would feel if she discovered he was dating her daughter. On the other hand, Sarah was also struggling with her feelings. She couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Alex, but she didn't want to seem like an ingrate. Sarah spent 4 years studying education. She graduated with distinction. Dr. Alex started building a big school to be named after Mrs. Dan. It will be owned and managed by Sarah, as Mrs. Dan had retired from teaching. One evening, as Dr. Alex lay in bed, unable to sleep, he realized that he couldn't hold back his feelings any longer. He needed to tell Sarah how he felt. He quickly got out of bed and made his way to the living room. At the living room, he found Sarah seated, lost in thought. Their eyes met, and in that moment, they both knew what was about to happen. "I can't stop thinking about you, Sarah," Dr. Alex confessed, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "You're kind, strong, and everything I've ever wanted. I've fallen in love with you, Sarah." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. "I feel the same way, Alex. But I was afraid. I didn't want you to think I was trying to repay your kindness with my feelings. I've grown to love you with all of my heart." Dr. Alex takes her hand. "Same here, Sarah. My love for you is real." The next day, Dr. Alex obtained permission from Mrs. Dan to date Sarah. Her joy was palpable. She kept laughing heartily the entire day. Dr. Alex proposed shortly to Sarah. She accepted, and their wedding preparations ensued. Their joy knew no bound. Dr. Alex surprised Sarah and her mother with their own personal cars each. They couldn't believe their eyes. Dr. Alex and Sarah celebrated their traditional and white wedding ceremonies and proceeded for their honeymoon trip in Paris, while they left 2 maids to take care of Mrs. Dan. Dr. Alex and Sarah returned from their honeymoon after 3 weeks. Shortly, they discovered Sarah was pregnant with twins. Dr. Alex took maximum care of Sarah. Theirs was a marriage made in heaven. Sarah delivered of her twin babies, a boy and a girl. Their joy knew no bound. 6 months later, the school was completed and named Tina Dan Schools, after Mrs. Dan. Sarah managed the school successfully while Mrs. Dan rested at home while babysitting her grandchildren with the maids. Dr. Alex continued being an amazing husband while managing his medical profession perfectly. One night, Mrs. Dan was seated with her daughter and her husband after the kids had been put to bed. Mrs. Dan pondered on what could have been if she had refused to help Ken. They might still be lacking help till date. "I didn't know my kindness yesterday was the seed I needed to sow for the harvest of my miracle today. If I didn't help Ken, we might still be helpless till date, or I may be dead by now. No wonder the Bible encouraged us to cast our bread upon many waters, do good to different people, invest in different things, for you do not know which one will be of benefit. You helped me back, then even when there were no signs of me being able to pay back, you are my angel," Dr. Alex replied. Mrs. Dan takes his face hand, smiles at him. Sarah on her path was grateful she didn't take the wrong path by giving in to Mr. Gouda's illicit request, just like the biblical Joseph refused to give in to Potiphar's wife, which could have blocked his way to the palace. She was glad. She waited till her knight in shining armor. The amazing Dr. Alex came and saved them from their lives of misery. Mrs. Dan chipped in. "Indeed, the good we do today can produce the blessing we seek tomorrow." They all smiled. holding one another closely as they savored the sweetness of the lives they had created for themselves, a life filled with love, gratitude, respect, and the circle of kindness that had brought them together. The end. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more interesting and inspiring stories.